Prashant, please switch off your audio. Okay, so good morning, all of you. Welcome to the fourth day, and we have only one more day to go. And we have a great sessions today, starting with Sweta in the morning, and followed by Dr. Parvati, Professor Head, Department of JNT, Department of English, and followed by Mukundanand Ji in the afternoon at 3:45. So that's a great session today because we are starting with resilience and optimism. It's a great topic. Sweta has opted to take it. Okay, and she masters it, by the way. So may I now request, without taking so much, Dr. Sweta Mukherjee, to all of you. Madam, please.
Thank you so much, sir, for this opportunity. Thanks to all the staff and faculty members of St. Martin's College who have put together this webinar. And I think I'll just take a few minutes to locate myself and tell you a little bit about myself. The reason this
Ma'am, 1 minute. Let somebody is going to introduce you, by the way. 1 minute.
No, that's fine, sir. I don't mind.
Madam, 1 minute. We have it, madam.
Okay.
We have going with our protocols. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone.
Switch on.
Dr. Sweta Mukherjee has a PhD in English language education.
What happened, sir? Panda sir, what happened?
Madam, your voice is not.
Chandrakala ma'am is in mute.
Unmute yourself now.
Good morning, everyone. Dr. Sweta Mukherjee has a PhD in English language education and has been working in higher education for 5 years. She is an assistant professor with the Department of English Studies at Christ University. She was a Fulbright scholar in the year 2012 to 13 to the University of West Georgia. She has been also working with the Teaching Learning Enhancement Cell at Christ University since 2015 and has worked extensively on the teaching, learning, and assessment practices across the university. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Sir, should I begin now?
Sorry, madam. Sorry for the
No,
comfortable situation right
sir,
now.
no problem. No, when I can.
Okay. Please,
so
thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us.
No problem, sir. It's a pleasure. So once again, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for this opportunity. When sir reached out to me, the reason I was laying down a little bit more of my context is when Dr. Panda reached out to me and he said that we are having a webinar on emotional intelligence. I think that was something that was very close to my heart. My PhD is in emotional intelligence, and over the past few years, I have been working with emotional learning in education. Now, I'm aware that today's group is a very mixed group, and that's why it was slightly challenging for me to see how do I pitch my presentation. As Dr. Panda said, we have faculty members, we have bureaucrats, we have people involved in several other professions in life. And it's interesting that the same situation that has brought life to a halt has also made us come close to each other in different ways. So the COVID-19 has been, in a way, has been a connecting medium, because I think we have some 200 odd people today, and probably this was not possible at such a short notice if not through the digital medium. So let's see how the session goes. I'm not going to talk about a lot of theory or a lot of research, because I think that is available, that can be made use of. But I'm going to begin with certain, certain ways in which I have seen resilience and optimism. So I'm going to, I have a very short presentation. So I'm going to try putting it up, and if I cannot see the chat when I'm presenting, so if somebody can just let me know whether they can see it once I start the presentation. Give me one moment, I'll try to get this fixed. Just one moment. I actually had to switch tabs between Chrome and Mozilla because my Chrome was giving me a little issues. So I had to switch my tab. Just a moment, please. I think we should be able to see the presentation. Can somebody, I can't see the chat also from here. So can somebody tell me if we can see the presentation?
Yeah, ma'am, it's
Okay,
visible.
I'll just enlarge the screen. Yeah. So I've been working with the Department of English at Christ Interview University for the past 5.5 years. In fact, immediately after I finished my PhD, I have a very, very close and a very intimate connection with Hyderabad. I can say I am from Hyderabad because I stayed almost 8 to 9 years of my life there, and I think it's one of my favorite places on earth. It's home for me. So when this opportunity came my way to talk to people, and it came from my home, and it came from people who are also connected to me, because Dr. Panda was my super senior. I'm sure there are who also would have studied at some point at the English and Foreign Languages University. I'm a proud alumni of the English and Foreign Languages University. I thought that this would be a best opportunity to connect to a lot of people. Now, all of you must be surprised. What is this? Why am I showing you vegetables? They're pretty though, but this has nothing to do with the presentation. This is just to give you a warning. A little bit of a warning that throughout the next 1.5 hours, you will see a lot of these sold outside. You'll actually hear a lot of these sold outside my house. My street is quite busy, and there might be disturbances. So you will see people selling vegetables. You will see airplane noises. It can get a little bit noisy, and I apologize for that. But I just thought I'll give you a sort of warning saying these are disturbances of the medium that we probably will have to deal with. So I hope you're all prepared for that. And I have this really, really funny thing, because all of this happens when I am in class and my students have a field day. But here I'm talking to an audience who I right now cannot see. Most of you I don't know. So I thought it's better that we begin with a slight idea of our speciality and where we are located. So my space, I actually live in a very busy street in Bangalore, and there are continuous vendors outside my house, and they have started using those loudspeakers, so you'll hear these noises. So I'm really sorry for that, and hope we can hear each other over that. So for the next few minutes, or next around 1.5 hours is the time that's given to me, and I'll try and stay within that time. We are going to talk about a very, very important aspect, which is resilience and optimism. But before that, I would like to begin with a story. This is not my story, but this is a story that has stayed with me for a really, really long time. I remember in 2017, in the summer break, I traveled to Ooty. And this was the only book. I'm sure a lot of you might be familiar with this book, but for those of you who are not, this was the only book I had. So I picked up the book. I had no expectations. It was, I like reading. So when I saw the title, I was very, very curious. And I picked up this book, and I went, and I reached to.
You're not audible.
Madam, you're not audible. Shweta ma'am, you're not audible.
We really didn't want to miss the story, sir.
Yeah, 1 minute, just a minute. Please write down on the chat box so that she will get it. Otherwise, I'm giving you a call.
The chat is not visible, she said.
Okay, just a minute.
Sir, I think there was an internet issue. I'm getting back, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Just 2 minutes.
Okay. Sorry for the inconvenience. There was some technical issues there. So she's joining back. All of you, I'm sorry for the inconvenience caused, and there is some technical glitch over there at her place. So she's joining back within a minute.
Sir, can you tell me something about your college?
My college?
Yes, sir.
I am, we are St. Martin's College of Engineering, sir, engineering college situated in southern plateau of Hyderabad, in Secunderabad, mostly. And we are NAC A+, sir, and just 27 colleges are there in NAC A+ rank along with us. So we have been working for a good one, and we got a, various awards, and by the by, we got it, Paramash, that is the latest one, and Atal Innovation Center also, they have given us a blessing on Atal. Sweta is back. Okay.
Yeah, I apologize.
Yeah.
I think my internet got disconnected for some reason. I'm really sorry. So I will just display my presentation once more.
That story people are interested in. Please continue with the story.
Yes, sir. I will be there in a while. Right. So like I was saying, so this is the story of an American neurosurgeon, Dr. Paul Kalanithi. Dr. Paul Kalanithi was in his final year of residency, and all of us know how the medical profession is extremely stressful. Dr. Kalanithi's wife was also a resident doctor at that point of time. They were both in their residency period. And one fine day, he realized that he has a really bad backache, a very bad backache. And, in neurosurgery, you have to stay in the operation theater for really long hours. So he realized that he was getting really, really fatigued. So initially, he put it off as overwork. And at one point, during a surgery, he collapsed. And that's when they realized that this is not overwork, this is probably something deeper than that. An X-ray later confirmed that his lungs were not in a very good shape, and that he probably was on stage 4 of lung cancer. An extremely successful resident, living his American dream, was married to a lady that he really loved. Of course, their marriage at that point was slightly hitting a rocky road because both of them were resident doctors. They did not have time to spend with each other. So they knew that there were undercurrents of, problems in the marriage, but they also probably at some point had talked about separation. And this is not what I am saying. This is what Kalanithi writes in his book. It's a memoir that he has written. And in all of that, he had to bear the news that he had cancer. And the rest of the book, I would urge you to read it, is his journey with accepting this truth and to decide what he is going to do with it. Is he going to let this truth ruin his entire whatever is left of his life? Or is he going to take this truth head on and challenge it and live till the last day? And there's a line in this book in which he says, "For as long as I breathe, I was alive." And I think that is the most amazing line that I could bring close to my life. So after struggling through various stages of grief, he finally accepted that he had cancer. But what he decided to do was to not let the cancer win. He did go through a series of chemotherapy, which did make him weak. The cancer was already at its last stages. But during his last year on earth, they decided to become. They decided to have a child. Which was a decision that was long pending. And he says, I was never sure about it because I'd always put everything else before, before family. And I realized that at that point of time, I want to leave something behind. And the only thing I could leave behind was a life. And when he passed away, so the epilogue of the book is written after he passed away. He couldn't complete the book. In fact, he started writing the book during his 1-year battle. But he couldn't complete the book. He left it incomplete. The conclusion, the epilogue of the book, was written by his wife. And by the time the day he passed away, he already had a daughter. She was around a few months old. And his wife then writes about what he saw at the last moments, at the last couple of months in his life. And I think that is why it is very important for us to realize that tragedy, that adversity doesn't discriminate. It falls on all of us. Research in EI will tell you that emotional intelligence is something that you need to build up. Now, all of us might think, why? I know all of this. I mean, who's going to come and tell me that adversity and pain doesn't happen to me? I know it. I face it every day. True. But are we really, really facing it? It has become a part of our life. We all, I mean, I'm sure here there may not be a single person who has at some point not thought that's it, this is the end. We've all hit rock bottom. Personally, I think my lowest point in my career, in my entire life, and I think it was the lowest point for my family as well, and I've never shared this on a public platform, but in my 12th grade, I was doing very, very well. I did brilliantly in my 10th grade. I got a very good percentage. And I was always inclined towards arts, towards literature. But in 10th grade, when you get a really good percentage, all your friends are taking science, you end up taking science. So I ended up taking science. I shifted schools. And to be very honest, to put it very mildly, I struggled with it. I took pure science. So I had a physics, chemistry, computer science, and maths option. And so I struggled with it. I was a very good student. 11th grade, my grades started falling. My parents were extremely encouraging, but also at the same point were very worried about my future. And if some of you are from Odisha, back then you could either do a medical or an engineering. Arts was not an option. Arts was left for those people who didn't do anything else. So my parents were also worried that I would be one of those people who didn't do anything else because I couldn't do anything else. And anyhow, I did manage to, pass 11th grade. In 12th grade, the pressure increased. And at one point, it became unbearable. So much so that I barely managed to pass my mathematics paper. I actually got the borderline marks, just the borderline marks, with all God's grace. My 12th grade percentage was not that. I still had a first class, but it was not that good. It was not that good that would get me into a good engineering college. And by then I had realized I don't want to do engineering. I couldn't do medical because I had left biology long back. And I was at crossroads. I did not know what to do. What I did know is I loved reading literature. At that point of time, honestly speaking, nothing seemed to matter. My 10th grade marks didn't seem to matter. A lot of relatives who used to come to our house kind of stopped coming or were being very sympathetic, saying, oh, you just passed 12. Maybe you should take a year's break. Maybe you should prepare. I didn't know what to do at all. But eventually, I decided that I can either let this define the rest of my life, or I can decide how I define the rest of my life. I can either be a poor student who scored very badly in the 12th grade and just had whatever option they could get. I did get into the engineering college. I think Odisha at that point of time had the women's quota. I'm not sure if it still has it, but it did. And I did get into an engineering college. I was not sure which one, but I was sure that I would not survive in engineering college. I couldn't. There is too much maths and too much physics in engineering for me to survive. But at that point, that seemed to be a wise choice. My relatives you. Hello, is somebody saying something?
No,
Sorry,
please continue. Please continue.
Okay. So my relatives told me, why don't you do engineering? 4 years, you'll get a job. At least you can at least earn, and in those days 20,000 was a big deal, so you can at least earn 20,000. You'll get in some company, or even if you don't get, the next point for a woman is you pass engineering, will get you married to an engineering graduate, and at least both of you will live happily ever after. None of that was happening. I didn't let other people decide what I was going to do with my life. I remember after my 12th grade, for 2 months I didn't know what to do. I did search for all colleges that were offering arts and science outside Orissa. They all required above 90%. And I did not have above 90%. And if some of you have children who are right now in 10th or 12th grade, you will realize that that is the toughest struggle at that point of time. Of course, it's not compared to everything else that a lot of people have faced. But for me at that point of time, that was my toughest struggle. And that's when my parents came, and I remember my dad saying that this is a decision that's going to shape the rest of your life. So take it very carefully. There's no rush. I decided to do what I was suited for at that point of time because of my grades. And I applied to one of the, colleges in Sambalpur. And that's where I'm from, by the way, in Sambalpur in Odisha. And I applied for an English honors degree. I did have to sit for an entrance as well. I got through the English honors, and 3 years of my life, my only aim was to get into a master's program, and I did not want to get into a private university. I wanted to get into a central university and get into a master's program in English. And I really, really worked hard for it. After that, the rest is history. I came to this Central Institute of English and Foreign Languages, now known as the English and Foreign Languages University, and it did shape the rest course of my life. And I think I'm in one of the best professions in my life because I really enjoy doing what I do. But apart from that, this is a very minor incident, nothing compared to what a lot of people go through. But adversity is a part of all of our lives. It doesn't discriminate the rich from the poor. It doesn't discriminate the sick from the healthy. It affects all of us. How we deal with it, how we choose to deal with it. Do we choose to be resilient, to be optimistic, to know how to be resilient? And can it be a skill that can be cultivated? Is it something that we can teach ourselves? If it is, I think we all should. So let's see if it is. Before we talk about this, let's talk about grief. We don't talk about grief nowadays. All you see on social media is happy pictures. You see smiling people, you see relationship status that says happily married or in a relationship with, but you never hear of relationship statuses that break. You never hear of heartbreaks on social media. When I open my Facebook page, I feel everybody is having a much better life than I did. I still remember I just gotten married in 2014 and I had just finished my PhD. So I was fresh out of PhD into a marriage. I married a guy I've known for 8 years. But what is interesting is for that 1 year where I was waiting for my PhD viva, I believed that I was not capable of anything because I wasn't getting a job anywhere without my PhD degree. I was in a very different town where I did not know the language at all, so I hardly had people to talk to. And all I wanted was to go out and get a job. And though that 1 year was the most terrible year because I thought I will never be able to get a job. Because I didn't get a degree. I think I waited for my PhD degree for around 9 to 10 months. It was a really long wait. And I think at some point I could have slipped into depression. Similarly, a lot of us go through different stages of grief. The first stage is shock. You're shocked that something like this is even happening to you. Yesterday I heard a very, very disturbing news. One of my professors who had taught me in my UG, in fact, they were husband and wife. One of them is, they're a very powerful literary couple in our town. And I just heard my mother yesterday called and told me that my professor passed away due to COVID. In a lot of ways, I haven't spoken to him for so many years. I graduated long back in 2006, but it did break my heart. Imagine that happening to somebody who's close to you. You're shocked and sometimes you're in denial. In fact, Kalanidhi talks about how he did not believe he could ever have cancer. He was a neurosurgeon. He was out there curing people. Cancer was not something that was supposed to happen to him. He was young. He died at the age of 30. Young people don't die of cancer. But he says that that is the shock stage where you don't know that this has happened. And then you live in denial. So in the book, you would see Kalanidhi, after the news that he had cancer, he actually goes increasing his working hours, because he says, if my body will fight against it, if I fight against it with my mental strength, I can fight against cancer. I am denying the fact that I have something that is affecting me. I am denying my grief. The next stage is anger. You're angry that this has happened to you. You know, you're angry that this could affect your life. It could be anything. It could be a personal tragedy. It could be a natural calamity. It could be anything that you can think of. But at some point, we go through these stages. And then you start bargaining with it. You start trying to negotiate. You start trying to deal with it in ways you think are possible. When that fails, you realize that you're going into a state of depression. You're going into a state from where, and this is the most crucial state, because if you stay in this state, that's when life seems to not have a point at all. But if you accept that this is a stage, like we say, this too shall pass, every stage passes, that's when you reach acceptance. And I think it's very important for us to go through these stages. You cannot reach acceptance at the very beginning, because that means you're not dealing with your grief. Now, later part of the presentation, I'll also talk about, does dealing with your grief mean, or just avoiding your grief mean you're resilient, or dealing with your grief mean you're resilient? And how does emotional intelligence come into the picture? I will connect all of this. But what is important for us is to understand that our emotions are not arbitrary. They have a seat in our brain. They have a rational reason for existence. For a very long time in research, if you notice, emotion and reason were seen as two opposite sides of the coin. They never were seen as things that would function together. However, if you read research on emotional intelligence, and I'm sure for the past 4 days that you've been having your sessions on emotional intelligence, you would have known that emotion is not devoid of reason. People often say, oh, you're being too emotional. Oh, you're reacting too emotionally. Those are comments that you make when you let your emotion take over your reason. But when you marry emotion with reason, that's when you are becoming more emotionally competent, more emotionally intelligent. And for that to happen, every stage of this emotion is necessary. Therefore, to go through these stages of grief is important for us. When we are in an adverse situation, what is important for us is to ask us this question: how do we perceive ourselves? Do we let adversity, pain, anger, loss, death, and suffering define us? Or do we deal with this? Resilient people decide to deal with it. Emotionally intelligent people, as research says, can deal with extremely stressful situation because they begin with recognizing the stress. As you know, that the different aspects of emotional intelligence include self-realization, controlling or managing your emotions, empathy, social skills, etc. But what is most important is self-realization. You need to realize what's happening to you. I'm here going to talk about myself as an educator, and I think a lot of fellow educators here would also connect with me. We're dealing with an increasingly fragile generation, a generation that has an image of themselves that they live by. And to live by this image is hard. I have had students in my class who cannot take it if I'm shouting. If I shout or I don't shout in class, I do raise my voice. And all of you might have known by now, I do have a loud voice as well. If I have a loud voice, one of my students started breaking down and crying in class because she felt that I was loud. I was too loud, and I was scolding the entire class for not having done something that they should have done. This was my voice, and I was just telling them how they are being irresponsible. So she started shivering in my class, and she had what is called a panic attack. Now, as a teacher, the first time I saw panic attack, I didn't know what to do with it. It had never happened to me. and I had not known anybody who was suffering from bouts of panic attack. Over the past 5 years, I have seen a lot of students have it. And I asked this question to one of my colleagues. He's a very respected professor in psychology. And I said, why? Why is it that this generation is so fragile, that they can't take failure, that they can't take the fact that somebody is critiquing them? And the answer was interesting, because they don't deal with pain. They have everything that is given to them, and they live in an alternate reality of social media. Now, if some of you would have had the fortune to watch the film, the documentary, The Social Dilemma on Netflix, if you haven't, I would suggest you do. It tells you how our perceptions of ourselves, our perceptions of happiness, beauty, life, kind of now starts and ends in social media. Of late, you have seen that COVID-19 has halted our lives. It has completely halted our lives. I haven't been out of my house for the past 7-8 months now. It's very difficult for me to talk to a machine. I'm an extremely extrovert person. I love meeting people. And when I'm not allowed to do it, initially, the first 21 days of lockdown was the toughest for me, because I said, why is this happening? Why is China letting this happen? It was stupid, I know, but you have to blame someone, right? And after those 21 days, I decided, if this is how it's going to be, you might as well enjoy this. Might as well work at home and look at how you can use it. So now I work from home, and I can fit in a lot of other things. I can fit in self-care. I do a lot of yoga while I am in between classes, which is obviously not a possibility. But coming back to perception, how do we define ourselves? Do we let the world show us an image of who we are, how we react to things, or how we should react to things? For instance, like I was saying, the COVID-19 has brought our lives to a halt. What social media feeds give you when you scroll up your Facebook, if you love traveling like I do, is this numerous travel getaways, staycations, and work from hills, etc., options. And you feel looking at them and saying, oh my God, look at these people, look at the writer, he's having a brilliant life. I am stuck in this house and it's COVID and it's making my entire life a mess. But this writer is actually going and enjoying himself. Our students, our colleagues also go through similar emotions. How do we ensure that we provide a positive atmosphere, that we nurture positivity? Not just, it doesn't begin in other people's houses. It begins with you. The reason I decided to focus the first half of my presentation on individual self is I believe that when you yourself make ways to understand, to perceive, to read emotions, to take a call, to be persistent in an effort to develop resilience, and I have made this point, I call it developing resilience because it is a developable quality. That's when you can see a reflection of it in the environment around you, whether you're an educator, whether you're an employer, whether you are a self-employed person. You need to work on yourself to be able to work with other people. So how we perceive ourselves, how we see ourselves, how we see our losses, how we see things that have happened to us, how we deal with adversity becomes very important because it reflects on a series of behavior. Research in emotional intelligence with organizational behavior will tell you that emotional intelligence and resilience to a large extent also define our personality, right? And since these are not static qualities, they are changeable, they are fluid, you can always at whatever age cultivate them through certain very simple steps. We are going to talk about that in a while. If you look at a research definition of, and I decided to include this definition because I believe that there might be a lot of faculty or fellow participants who would be interested in research. I did not want to make this presentation too academic because I wasn't sure was it supposed to be a research bound presentation, so I tell me how successful or unsuccessful I have been. But anyway, let's look at a research-based definition of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence, resilience, my bad, sorry. Resilience is a developable capacity. It is a capacity to rebound or bounce back from adversity, from conflict, from failure, or even from positive events, progress, and increased responsibility. Why do we need to bounce back from positive events? Why do we need to bounce back from progress? Because everything is temporary. A positive event is positive, it leaves you with positivity. But if it's followed by a catastrophe, do you let the high of the positive event stay with you and say, I can't deal with this because I was so happy a moment back or a year back? Do you live in the past, or do you let that event energize you and help you to bounce to the current situation? How do you live in the present? A colleague of mine last year, as he joined work, was promoted very, very soon into coordinating different associations, working with different people. He was at the peak of his academic and professional career as soon as he joined this new institution. This year, the institution was downsizing. And he was one of the first people who was told that, look, you have these extra responsibilities. Right now, we cannot afford to keep you in these positions because we are downsizing. So we will only keep you as an adjunct, and we are taking away all these positions from you. He was devastated. For him, it meant a cut in salary. More than that, it probably at somewhere played with his ego saying, what did I do wrong? The pandemic is not my fault. Why am I being laid off? He was not completely laid off, but like partially. And it took him months to understand that this is not his problem alone. This is a problem that is faced right now by millions of people across the world. Millions of people across the world are facing deeper problems. There's homelessness, there's loss of jobs, people are being furloughed without any backup plan. People who have no savings are finding themselves at the end of the rope without any money. And that's when he realized that he's fortunate enough to at least have the job. And he says, you know what? I'm going to work as much as I can as in this adjunct position. And probably if they see my work and they like it, they'll realize that they might as well keep me in all the other positions. Let me just work. But it took a long time for that transition to happen. All of us can make that transition. If adversity can affect all of us, then the ability to bounce back is also within all of us. How we cultivate it, how we work towards growing it, how we understand that this is non-negotiable because there's only one life and you have to live. That is what makes us who we are. Like I said, you can either let a situation define you, or you can decide how you define yourself in that situation. And the reason I go back to the book, When Breath Becomes Air, is Kalanidhi did not let cancer define him. He lives in all of us. He lives in all his readers. In fact, I remember after I read that book, I couldn't react. For an entire day, I sat and read it, and I was numb. Because if you read the book, you feel the pain that the person has gone through. I've never known this person. I know him only as a name. I've never seen him. The book has a picture though. And yet I felt connected to him. And I felt if this is not what defines him, then nothing else does. And he chose to define himself that way. He chose to make his battle into a narrative. He chose to tell his story. We all have our stories. We need to be able to tell our stories, and we need to be able to tell it the way we want them. Of course, there's a lot of positivity. A lot of you might think I sound like a motivational speaker. I'm not. I'm not a motivational speaker. In fact, I go through the same emotions that all of you do. For the past 3 months, I've been working all days, including Sundays, because we have had a series of webinars. In fact, Dr. Panda will tell you that half of the time he cannot get me on phone because I cannot pick my phone. I'm in one webinar or the other. We've been working with webinars, we've been working with paper corrections, we've been working with students, we've been dealing with student counseling because a lot of our students are either victims of COVID-19 or have people like their parents who are suffering from COVID-19. And in all of that, you have to keep a grip on yourself. I think, I know that this is a mixed group, but I would say educators or faculty has the toughest of job. We need to be able to be take in everything. You know, we need to be able to soak everything because we can't talk about it. Where do we go? Our students come to us. Where do we go? You know, so we've become counselors. We've become, I don't know, the multiple roles that we are playing apart from the fact that we are learning new technology. This is a testimony of humankind. We have not let COVID-19 stop us. We are still meeting across the globe. We are still discussing. We're still talking. We could have let the situation take over us. We could have said it's a pandemic. We can't do anything. All of us should just be at home and not do anything because we don't know how to deal with it. But humanity hasn't given up. We have not given up. My cousin has been working since the first day. He has had no lockdown. He's a central government employee, so he goes to his office every day with minimal number, and he says that, you know, in a way, it's interesting that it is keeping me sane. There is so much happening around you. There's so much happening to people close to you that you do find your sanity, your resilience within this situation. It will not come from somewhere else. It will not come from outside. Things are not going to change over a period of time. The second thing I thought about when I was looking at this definition is our idea of normal. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge the COVID-19 situation now. What is normal for us? Is our life normal anymore? Till last year, if some of you have come to Bangalore or are from Bangalore, you will know that the pollution levels in Bangalore were really high, very, very high. I used to walk to my university. I live very close to Christ. And I used to carry a mask, but I never wore it because I felt, you know, it was very suffocating. I couldn't breathe. And I felt, oh my God, people are going to laugh at me if I wear a mask. Today, when I go out, I see everyone wearing a mask. It's almost like you're in a zombie movie with an apocalyptic situation at any given point. In fact, I had to go out one day during the complete lockdown, and I think I've never seen Bangalore that empty. The entire city was empty. It almost looked like there is some sort of virus that has wiped humanity away. From that to where we have reached now. Yes, maybe our numbers are not down. Maybe we still don't have a vaccine. Maybe we are not getting enough information on what's happening. People are still suffering. A lot of people have lost their lives. But at the same time, there are people who live. The vegetable vendors I was talking about, you should see how innovative they've got over the past few years, over the past few months. They're now probably more technologically savvy. They all have GPay. They all use those blowhorns to sell their vegetables. And these were people who were supplying to wholesale, hypermarkets. With the hypermarkets not buying directly from them, they then took to the streets. And now most of them have become regulars here because they bring fresh vegetables to your home at a much more subsidized rate. As human beings, look at how we have started to negotiate with what life has thrown at us. Of course, we haven't been able to completely negotiate. We still have our bouts of depression. We still have anger that the virus is affecting us. But a lot of us have chosen not to be defeated. This is a situation that we are living by, and we have to live by. How do we decide to rebound? How do we decide to bounce back? If resilience is a developable capacity, then we need to be able to develop it. Research shows that emotionally intelligent people are more resilient and optimistic by nature. Again, like I said, emotionally intelligent people are not born emotionally intelligent. It's not a static quality. It is a quality that can be developed. If you read works of Peter Salvoy-Meyer and Daniel Goleman, the few whose works are extremely, extremely well known and who gave rise to this entire idea of emotional intelligence, you will see that they insist that emotional intelligence is cultivated. And if something is cultivated, you just have to put in the effort for you to do it. How do you do it? One of the ways that as an educator I have learned or I have seen happening is through looking at education as a more holistic process. We're not creating machines who are out there to do their jobs. We're creating individuals. A shift towards whole person or holistic education is one way of doing it. A curriculum that looks into social emotional learning, that looks into integrating emotional skills with cognitive skills is perhaps the way out. In Yale University, you have the Center for Emotional Intelligence, and they have worked extensively on social emotional learning. In fact, there's a entire organization called the Center for Academic, Social and Emotional Learning, CASEL. You can look them up online and you will see that they have done this really interesting projects. In fact, Goldman is one of the founding members. Daniel Goleman is one of the founding members of CASEL. And you will see that they have done this amazing amount of work with schools across the US where they have integrated social emotional learning into the curriculum. Now, coming from a higher education background, I can tell you that at school level, there is still an insistence on social emotional learning. But at the higher education level, at the level of university, we don't look at educational learning at all because we believe that we only adhere to the cognitive needs. But it is our students who go out to the industry. It is our students who are job creators, who are job seekers. It is our students who face the real world. How can then academia be separated from reality? How can you have a division or how can you have a process of study that does not look at emotional learning, that does not look at emotional skills? Now, a lot of people from management, engineering background will say, well, we train them in soft skills, we do interviews, we do skills. Those are skills that you require with good communication. Emotional intelligence, on the other hand, is an umbrella term. It encompasses all of these skills and much more. So it's not just life skills. It's not just somebody telling you positivity is the way to go and you become positive one day. It is the slow and steady inculcation of that idea into your entire belief system. So much so that the thread of your being believes that you are capable of being resilient, being persistent, being optimistic, and hence you work towards being a more emotionally intelligent being. Emotional intelligence begins with the idea of recognizing your own intelligence, recognizing and acknowledging your own emotions, and then choosing how to react with it. Emotionally intelligent people choose choose to proactively react in resilient and optimistic manner. In fact, research says that highly resilient people cultivate optimistic attitudes. They choose optimism through the ways they react to a situation, through the language that they use to speak, the language that they use to communicate. Instead of saying, I can't do it, let me see how else can I do it. I was reading a book or something yesterday where there was this very interesting anecdote where a person says too many people apologize for what they've done wrong. Very few seek out solutions of how not to do it again. We all make mistakes. We all fall into pits that we think we cannot get up from. But what emotional intelligence tells us, what literature tells us in emotional intelligence, what theory tells us, is we need to cultivate ways in which we can get out of that pit and ask the right questions. I just found this very, very interesting. Hope actually has hope is a very casually used word. You say, be hopeful, keep faith alive, have hope. But do we really know what hope is? How many of us are hopeful that we will come out of this situation? I'm going to tell you something that's very personal to me again. I'm a Bengali, and for me, the biggest thing in the year is round the corner. It is the Durga Puja. For Bengalis, it's next to their heart. Last few weeks I had spent in very not so happy mood because I thought this year I will not be able to celebrate it. You know, Durga Puja means 3 days of going out, 3 days of eating out, meeting friends, dressing up, all that you can decide that all that you think is happy. And then I realized that again, I can let my entire 6 to 8 months work from home be in my pajamas and my t-shirt with my camera off, and I can sulk about it, or I can take this challenge head on, get dressed, sit in front of my camera and take a class, and then also attend a virtual puja event that is happening somewhere else remotely. Yes, it's virtual, but at least it's happening, right? So in literature, this is what we call as hope, the hope that things will get better. Hope is a positive motivational state that is based on an interactively derived sense of successful. What do you mean by it? What do you mean by interactively derived sense of successful? You choose to see what actions will lead you to success, and you choose to work in those manner. If you are a person who displays those actions, who takes challenges head on, who decides to work with hope, you will see that a lot of people around you will mirror those actions. So in a way, it's like a ripple effect. Your positivity, your ability to be resilient affects people around you as well because they mirror your behavior. And they see that you're more content or you're more equipped to deal with the situation because you have the emotional tools that are required to deal with the situation. You're not just doing it because you don't have anything else. You're not letting things crush you down. Instead, you're choosing how to deal with it. And let me tell you that this can be very simple. This can be getting, like I said, dressing up for a webinar. This can be reading a good book. This can be switching off technology completely on one day and saying, I'm not going to do anything but stare at the ceiling, and trust me, it helps. It's your way of dealing with it. Emotional intelligence is not a pill. Resilience is not a pill that you take and you become resilient. But how do you find the right tools? How do you find the right equipments to develop resilience? What are the strategies through which you can do it? How do resilient people work? What is that one trait that makes them different from people who lack resilience or who are cynics or who believe that the world is going to end anyway? Why should I survive? You know, how do you live with cynical people? I am keeping a check on time, so if I'm running over my time, please let me know. But yeah, how do you keep a check? How do you live with people who are cynical? How do you see hope in an environment where there is no hope? Where hope seems to be a far distinct possibility. Again, we probably are living in that environment right now. We don't know when a vaccine is going to be out. We don't know when the normal that we know is ever going to return, or is it going to be a new normal. But the shift from returning to the normal to accepting the new normal is a journey of resilience. That is a journey of hope. That is a journey of optimism. And people who consciously cultivate this can work towards this journey. Like I said, resilient people proactively cultivate habits that help them to stay positive. Resilient people choose how they react to a situation. Not only that, they choose which situations they would react to. Not all the battles that you encounter are battles that you need to fight. You don't have to fight all your battles, right? There are different ways in which you can deal with things. Sometimes walking away from a situation is good for your peace of mind. Sometimes acknowledging that a particular situation and your reaction to that situation is harming you is good for you because you realize it's harming you. I also work with students between the age of 20 to 19 to 25, so postgraduate and undergraduate students. And increasingly, a lot of my students have very complicated relationships issues. Some of them come from broken families. Some of them have been in abusive relationships. And these relationships need not just be romantic. They have been abusive relationships with their parents as well. Some of them have relationships with their parents where they have been well cared and provided for, but their parents are never around. And a lot of these issues reflect in the way they behave in our classrooms. My classrooms become spaces where I study individuals, I study people. Like I was talking about a holistic model of education, we at Christ have something called as holistic education as a module where we talk about, we work very interestingly. So what we do is we look at the problems our students are facing, at large the youth is facing. And we develop these modules that then help our students to work towards developing skills that are necessary for them to deal with life. To understand that there's no escape. It's one life, you've got to live it and you've got to deal with it. Being a trainer in holistic education for the past 5 years has helped me deal with a lot of what I go through as well. None of us are perfect, we are all human beings. It's very easy to sit on a chair, talk to an audience about positivity. It is very difficult to do it when it affects you. If tomorrow I were to lose my job, I'm sure all of this that I'm going to talk about at one point is going to take a backseat and I am going to get upset. I am going to get sad. 2 years back, I had applied for a scholarship abroad. And I was very hopeful because I'd already had a scholarship. So I was hopeful that I would get it, but I didn't. And I was upset for like a day, but then I went back to my work. My work gives me a lot of happiness, and I met my students, and I thought maybe this is what I am right now meant to do. Meant to do. I'm at the right place at the right time, and this is what I tell my students too. So when you want to cultivate emotionally intelligent individuals, I know that again, let me say that I understand that the diversity in our needs may be different. Some of us are here because we need to know about it. Some of us are here because we believe that there are other people around us who can be worked with the idea of cultivating these qualities. But the point is, whether we are doing it for ourselves or we're doing it for others, it needs to begin with us, right? So when you talk to people, talk in language that spreads positivity. Do not, or very consciously avoid language that does not make you feel positive, that does not make you feel energized, that makes you feel negative. So instead of saying, oh my God, there's so much work that I have to do, you can just shift your language and say, well, there is a lot of work, it's challenging. It's very different when you say it's challenging rather than it's a burden, because if it's a challenge, you will face it. So just in these daily things that we do, in the way we choose to present ourselves, in the way we choose to talk, in the way we choose to participate in a discussion, or in the way we choose to stay away from a discussion, we are looking at building in this ability of resilience, of rising up, of not letting things define us, of building in hope through language. Um, all of us, like I said, can rise up from adversity. It's inherent in us. We are meant to rise up from adversity. We are probably not meant to deal with adversity at these levels because society. In fact, I was reading a book that said that society has evolved, yes, but it has not evolved to a point where we can deal with things that are affecting us right now. And here I would like to bring back social media. Now, social media shapes the way we see things. Social media shapes our entire perspective. Social media can break or make us to a large extent. You have teenagers in colleges who suffer from body dysmorphia, who suffer from gender dysmorphia, identity crisis because of increasive or excessive exposure to social media. How do you work with these teenagers? First, you acknowledge these issues. First, you acknowledge whether you as an individual suffer from these. For example, let us say that we are all talking about body dysmorphia. We are talking about body images. Social media has created images of perfect bodies. This is how we should look. This is what is accepted in a society. This is what is not accepted. A lot of our students, our colleagues, our fellow mates, our friends believe in it. Yesterday, I was talking to a friend. I had just met her a few days back. And I said, you know what? I find you extremely beautiful. You're so pretty. And she said, oh, but I'm very dark skinned. I don't think I'm pretty. And I was very shocked because you need to love yourself irrespective of the color of your skin. So then I sat her down and I said, why do you think it? And I realized that deep down at some point, somebody from her childhood had told her that you can never be considered beautiful because you are dark skinned. And though she's extremely successful as an entrepreneur, she's extremely successful as a mother, as a wife, whatever you define success as, that one thing has always stayed with her. But what is good about her is after an hour-long conversation, she acknowledged that this is a problem. That is the first step to rise up from adversity, to acknowledge that you have a problem, to acknowledge that this is a problem and right now I will deal with it. Or right now I cannot, so I'm not going to think about it. Or there are different ways and I can seek help to deal with it. You can work. All of us have the ability to work out a way. We have brains that are developed. We have the tools at our disposal. We have people who we can talk to. We also have an increased awareness of ourselves as a result of talking about the idea of emotional intelligence, right? And when that happens, then there are more opportunities, more scopes by which you can actually shape who you are. If you look at strategies to build in resilience and optimism, these are a few very simple strategies that we do every day and that we need to practice every day consciously. accept that suffering is a part of every human existence. I have a friend who lost her child. It was an accident. She was out grocery shopping in the car, and this was a couple of years back when I was abroad. And she was, of course, at that point of time older to me. And this happened when we were together. When I had known her. I remember it was a weekend. We didn't have classes, so she just called me and she said, "Hey, I'm going grocery shopping." And while she was talking to me on phone, her little girl jumped into the car, and then she said, "Okay, fine, so we can all go." And when they were going, they were hit by another car. She was thrown on one side, the daughter was thrown on the other side. The daughter immediately passed away. She survived, and I have seen her struggle through that. What she did is, after a very long time, she said it's very easy. We all used to tell her all of this, and she said it's very easy for you to talk. You've not suffered the loss of a child. Parent bereavement is one of the most intense kind of griefs that you can ever experience. But what she did is she decided to take steps to choose the emotions that she had to deal with. She decided to accept the grief at first, and then said, "I can let this grief tell me what to do with the rest of my life, or think about this grieve, because grieving is a part of a process, and then work towards healing, which is a very, very, very long, very exhausting process. And you may not ever be completely healed from the loss of a child." But at the same time, one of the little things that she did, and I took inspiration from that, is put up these quotes, on places where she could see them, very positive quotes about life and living. You have these beautiful placards around her kitchen, not placards, they're like these standees or, those boards that she puts, and it makes you feel positive when you just enter the house. Right? What I do is very interesting. So I'm an avid traveler. I love traveling. I think last year, every year I make one trip for recreation. I do a lot of solo trips. I also travel for work. This year has been especially hard because I've not been able to travel. But what I do is I have my fridge magnets in the kitchen. And I look at my fridge magnets and I feel happy about all the places that I have seen. I don't regret the fact that I couldn't see any new place this year, but at least those magnets remind me of a time that was good. And for a few moments, I see future in it, because COVID-19 is not a permanent situation. Like any other situation, no situation is completely permanent. So it's going to go away. And when it's going to go away, I would travel again, right? So that gives me hope. That gives me a way of dealing with things. Like I said, resilient and optimistic people choose carefully where to focus their attention. These are not sacrosanct strategies. These are not absolute strategies, but these are strategies that you can cultivate and that you can coach others to cultivate. When I faced a personal failure and did not do well in my 12th grade, I could either choose to focus my attention on all the negativity that was around me. Except my parents, everybody had a lot of sympathy, but nobody had empathy. And I'm sure by now you know the difference between sympathy and empathy. I wasn't willing to receive sympathy because I think it was important for me to understand that now that I am at a point where I cannot go to a college that I would have wanted to, what are my options available in Odisha, in Sambalpur? I also saw it as an opportunity of 3 more years of a stress-free life because my mom was there. Hostel life can be very, very stressful. But yeah, that came much later. And after that, I think the last time I was home, I was home, I studied was 2006 when I left Sambalpur. After that, I've never been home for more than 15 days at a time. And now when I look back, those 3 years of my graduation in a college in Sambalpur, I'm from Gangadhar Meher College, Sambalpur, were the best of my years because I used to go to college at 10. I used to come back by 12 and I had the whole day to myself. There would be 2 classes or 1 class. I lived very close to the college. But during that time, for me, it was a personal defeat because I didn't get placed in a college that I wanted to. However, you choose what you want to focus in life. Accept that there are things you cannot change. We cannot change the situation that there's a virus out there that can affect anybody. We cannot change the situation. I couldn't change the situation that I performed badly in my 12th. Kalanidhi couldn't change the situation that he had cancer. There are certain things that you cannot change, that will not work your way. So how do you deal with it? You accept it and you work with what you can change. I always tell this to my students. You cannot determine how others react to you. You can only determine how you react to them. You cannot say that I will have all my colleagues being very nice to me. They will not be, because they have their own battles to fight. But do you understand that, and do you choose to walk with it or walk away from it, or do you choose to retaliate? If you want to retaliate, it's only going to create a lot of displeasure. It's only going to create a lot of negativity. It's going to make your workplace environment extremely harmful, even in personal lives, right? We all shout, we all lose our temper. But this is one thing that I've learned very closely from my dad. My dad loses his temper in the flicker of a moment. Something happens and he loses his temper. So when he does lose his temper, the speed with which he loses his temper is the speed with which he gains his cool back. And I think for me, probably it's genetic. I don't hold on to grudges. I don't hold on to anger. I don't hold on to negativity. I have this saying that I tell my friends that I cannot. It makes me feel sick if there's too much negativity around me. I physically cannot hold on to negativity. But for some people, like for my brother, in fact, it's a cultivated act. When he started as a software engineer, he was working in Bangalore, and later he decided that, I'm not very happy with what I'm doing, so I want to do my MBA. He did his MBA in finance, went on to work with a bank where there were only 2 people working because it was an extremely protected area of the bank. So he used to go in the morning and the other person used to come in the night shift. And he said, oh my God, this is not helping me. I'm alone in a strange city. He shifted to Bombay. Bombay can be really hard on people. And he said, I don't want this. So initially for an entire year, he kept complaining about his situation. He lost cool with his boss. His boss wasn't telling him what to do. His boss also wasn't very supportive. And at one point he said, I cannot change the fact that right now this is my job. So what I can change is 6 months later, do I still want to continue in my job? And that's where he chooses to shift his company. He took a pay cut, went back into software management. His MBA right now is pretty pointless in his life. But at the same time, he did make a choice, a conscious choice. So there are things that you can change and there are things that you cannot change. Don't worry about things that you cannot change. Focus on things that you can change. What is important about resilient people, about people who are optimistic, is not that they only see candy floss and rose. They do see the thorns as well. They do see the darkness. But they choose to see the light at the end of the tunnel. They choose to see that after darkness, there's some light. They accept the darkness as a part of a transition process. Being resilient or being optimistic does not mean you diminish the negativity, but you choose to tune into the good. You consciously choose to focus on the good. Asking yourself questions such as, are your actions that you're doing right now harming you or helping you? For example, let us say that you've had a loss. You've lost someone you really, really like. I'll talk about a personal loss here again. When I was in 12th grade, my grandfather, my mother's father, he was diagnosed with cancer, lung cancer, and he lived with us for 1 year after his diagnosis. And one fine day, he passed away. It was a Sunday morning, I still remember. What I did at that point was very immature. It was a Sunday morning, and in those days you used to go to tuitions. I don't know whether we still go, but in those days we used to. So I had my chemistry tuition at 10 o'clock in the morning. And there was a lot of crying in the house. My grandmother was very silent. She was prepared, because it was 1 year that they knew, and she kind of knew that the pain and the suffering that he went through, he was only 70 at that point of time. In a way, for the fact that he passed away was to prevent him from more pain and suffering. But what I did is I said, you know what, I have to go to the tuition. I can't be here. So I went to the tuition. Obviously, I couldn't focus there. And that's when it got me thinking, did I do what I was supposed to do? Did I run away? Is this running away helping me in any way? And I realized it's not, because I wanted to see my grandfather one more time. And I talked to my tutor and I said, I need to go home because this is what has happened to me. And he said, okay, go ahead. So I went back home and I thankfully was able to see him on his last journey. But for one moment, one fleeting moment, I tried to escape. After that, there was a lot of sadness in the house. But I remember as a family, we decided that from now on, we are going to talk only about the good things that he has done. It will make him live in our memory, but it will also make him live in our memory in the happier times. A lot of times, we hang on to things, objects, situations, people, because we feel that we need them. But at some point, we need to question: what we doing is what we doing, are what we or sorry, I lost it. I kind of, so whatever we are doing, is it harming us or is it helping us? Is it helping us to remain positive or is it feeding into our negativity? If you harbor revenge, if you harbor anger, if you harbor negativity, how is it helping you? Is it helping you professionally? Is it helping you personally? Is it helping you become a better performer? Maybe none of it. So how do you let go of it? Take away emotions that don't help you. Emotions can be very dicey. Emotions can be very tricky. When I say take away emotion, and I think I would like you to focus here, which says that don't diminish negativity. Don't say I will not, there is nothing negative, because that's not true. Accept the negativity and focus on the positive. I think I believe in this, that you have to be kind to yourself. You have to know yourself. You have to understand that there are situations that you couldn't have done anything with. Now, how do I take all of this and apply it to what I do, to my work, to the way I look at for me, it is my students. For you, it may be your employees, your personal and professional relationships, your clients, anyone. How do I transgress these into the workspace that I am in, into my professional space? A lot of this is what happens into your personal space. How do I transgress this into my professional space? As an educator, like I mentioned earlier, one of the ways of looking at it is making it a part of your curriculum, an organized form of curriculum that stresses on the importance of emotional learning. As an employer or as a corporate person, or as a person who, apart from education, involved in any other industry, making it a part of your workspace. Small changes in the environment bring about positivity in the workspace. And there is right now a lot of negativity in and around us anyway. So even with COVID-19, when you go back to your workspace, I don't know if all of you are already there, but if some of you are going back, what are the changes that you can make in and around your workspace? What are the changes that you can make in your desk that will make other people come and just look at your desk? I remember I used to have this colleague who used to sit on the other side of the cabin than I was, and she had this fresh flowers put onto her desks every day. I was never a flower person, but I liked the fact that she had fresh flowers. And then what she did is she brought in little, I'm sorry about the noise. I told you that there will be a lot of traffic. But anyway, she brought in these little things that she really liked and kept it in one corner of her desk. And she used to correct mid-semester papers. And I asked her, why do you keep these things? And she said, these make me feel good. Those little things. And then as a department, we started doing it. We started changing the space that we were in. So I remember my head of the department, she still does it, sometimes used to put this amazing fragrance in the department, very fresh spring fragrance in her cabin. And we said, you know what, ma'am, we really like it. So she got one for the department. We also have focused talks, discussion groups where we share what we are feeling, where we share each day's struggle. These are voluntary, and you can look at something similar in your organizations. These can be for employers, these can be for leaders. One of the things that I have realized after being an educator for almost 5.5 years is that we don't take care of ourselves. If you're a leader, if you are heading something, if you're the most stressed person, to be a successful leader, you need to take care of yourself first. To understand that you need to be emotionally healthy for your team to be emotionally healthy. To promote a behavior, you need to be able to inculcate it within yourself, because people mirror your behavior. You can do it in organized, structured forms like these webinars that you have organized, because these are platforms where people come together. You can also do it in your everyday actions by inculcating certain smaller changes. You can look at a collaborative idea that comes from your colleagues or from your students. You can even look at personalizing classrooms for that matter. You can bring in content that is more appealing to different kinds of people, because of just if you notice all the pictures I chose today, I purposefully kept them very bright. I also chose the first picture very carefully. That was my way of connecting to all of you and telling you that, look, there will be disturbances. Of course, it was a warning that there will be disturbances outside, and I hope you don't get too disturbed. But also to probably have that human connect, that you're not just talking to a machine, you are talking to an individual who's simply like you. We all are going through the same struggles at this point, and I think no other crisis, at least in my lifetime, has united humanity in its emotions like COVID-19 has. So the point is that when you want to inculcate
Shweta,
into,
if I'm not interrupting you,
yeah.
I'm sorry, because today is the first day I joined. I don't know whether we have a QA session or not, but the thing is, this is from a personal point of view,
Okay.
but how would we handle a toxic workplace?
I know. I was just coming to that.
Luckily, I'm in a wonderful place, but as I see most, because as I hear most of my friends who are working in India, unfortunately, in such a bleak situation,
Absolutely.
they have very ugly grudges and
Yes.
all sorts of things. You have your own pain. Again, you want to inflict pain on someone. I understand it is so horrible, but the thing is, how is it that one can see this is beyond someone's control? You cannot find a job. You cannot quit this moment if you want to change the situation.
Absolutely.
How is it that someone can handle this situation?
So I don't know if there is one size fits all answer to it, but I'll tell you what I think is one of the ways I would deal with. I work in a very nice place, but I have had to deal with toxic situations sometimes. I think the one way I look at dealing with it is choosing to whether to give into the toxicity, because the toxicity can be one aspect of it. You may have issues with your immediate supervisor or your boss. You may have issues with a colleague. In fact, there could be several reasons, or just the work environment. But one of the things that you realize at this point is probably you cannot have anything else. This is your only option. So if this is your only option, then you will have to probably build in a very, very strong, sort of a wall around yourself, saying that I will not take these comments as personal judgments on who I am. I tell this to my students as well. We are also, it's also the way we accept criticism, and we separate it from the people that we are. Because all these people, these environments that make these judgments on who we are and how we deal with things, or, that constantly worry us all out points, a lot of them only know parts of us. They don't know entirely who we are. And the other thing is doing something to counteract that toxicity after your working hours that actually makes you feel good. It can be as simple as gardening, reading a book, doing a 1 hour exercise. You take time out for yourself. For me as an individual, it is very important to take time out for myself. Despite all the demands of family and work, there is 1 hour in the day that is completely for myself, and I will not make excuses for it. Neither will I be ashamed of taking it. There are times when I have not done a lot of other things because that 1 hour is important for me. Take time to, to just be with yourself. And I think it might sound very cliched, but I think it does help a lot. At least it helps me to deal with a lot of toxicity. And it's not just toxic workplace. Sometimes, especially in the digital medium now, with everything going on, you see a lot of people trolling. You see a lot of people making very negative, very unnecessary comments on people. Sometimes when we do these sessions, there are people who say, oh, you should have known better, or you can get somebody who knows technology. Sometimes we just ignore them. I remember sometimes we get very disturbing emails after doing a lot of work that particular aspect was not right. Thankfully, I work with a team that is very, very supportive. So I talk it out and I say that, look, we've received this email now. What do we do with this? And one of my team members would tell me, I think this is something we should ignore. We can't deal with it. So ignore what you can't deal with as long as you can. Face it head on if that's what you want to do, if that's what will bring in a solution. If you think that it's a situation that cannot be solved, then maybe just take it by the day and give some time for yourself to understand that your reactions to it, however irrational they might have seemed, were not rational. So I would again say, do not judge yourself so harshly. That's the only answer I have right now. And I also don't know if there's a Q&A session, but I think I'll run over my time. So I'm going to conclude with one small thing. It's again very cliched, but I completely believe in it. Have one small positive thought in the morning. Have that one thing that you want to be grateful for, and it can actually change the whole day. For me, it has been these 6 months. What I've done is developed one habit. So I used to go to the gym every day when I was working in college. After that, the gym closed down, and for 21 days, I actually did not do anything because I thought life has ended. COVID-19 has ended my life. That's it. And then I realized that that's not helping me. So from, I think, April end, I started doing a 1 hour workout every day. I don't have any equipments in my house. I have a very small space between a bed and a couch where I work out, but I do work out. Even on days that I can't make myself work out, I do, because that's the 1 hour that's mine. And I feel really good about the whole day. Of course, there are problems the entire day as well, but this 1 hour makes me feel very happy about myself. So I would say work with strategies, think in ways that are developmental for you. Don't let things that are, consciously keep negative thoughts in one corner and say, right now, this is not what I need to be thinking because it's not helping my action. So this is just, like I said, it's a choice that you make constantly. And you will have to remind yourself that you deserve it, irrespective of whatever situation you're in. And if you make a mistake, if you think that the entire world thinks you've done something, you don't have to conform to the ideas of norms. So thank you very much for this. And I think if I will stop sharing my presentation now, if we have questions, we can take them. I think my presentation is not being shared now. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I hope I've not taken up more time. And thank you so much. If we, sir, do we have question answer sessions?
Yes, we have. And if anybody is interested to ask questions, since Sansidhar has already asked a question. Okay, so anybody is interested in asking question? Yes, sir. There are a couple of questions that is popping up, madam, in the chat box.
Yes, sir. Okay, so okay, let me just go through the chat box. I think Sandhya ma'am have said when you stop ignoring people, they start calling you names. Yeah, but it's just their way of dealing with life. It's not your. I have one mantra that I learned from a colleague of mine, and I always use it. So I don't know. I'll share it with all of you. She said at some point when she can't deal with the things that are not necessary to deal with, she says, "Not my monkey, not my circus," and that has been my lifesaver. These are not my problems. I am not dealing with them. This is somebody else's problem. I can't. So if somebody else is telling you that something else has not happened where you were not instrumental for it to happen, what do you do in it? It's just blame game. Will you take it and react to it? We've had a lot of these conversational difficulties during this COVID session because most of it is work online. And despite doing work, you realize that, there are hierarchies at workplaces that you have to work with and all of these things that you keep in mind. And sometimes you're not equipped to deal with it. It's actually not an issue that you are responsible for. So then you just walk away and say it will sort itself out because I am not responsible for it. So, and it is true.
Madam, I have a question.
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Madam, we cannot satisfy everyone. We come across.
Yes, sir.
What is the proper technique to say no?
Sir, I have a few questions, but I'll answer yours first. I think the only way to say no is to say it directly, sir. You might irk a little, you might, for example, today morning, during, while I was preparing for this session, a colleague of mine sent me a message saying there is so-and-so work to be done. Please do it by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I've been doing this same work. It's been coming in batches for quite some time, and there are other people who share the same work. So I very politely told him that, look, I cannot do it by afternoon. If you give me time till the night, I can finish it because I'm busy in the morning. So then he said, oh, okay, then I'll give it to somebody else. So I think we should start saying no, because because we keep saying yes, people expect that you will keep saying yes. The only way to say no is to directly say it sometimes. I have one question that says how to ignore toxic people for long if they're close to you. Get away from them. Don't be close to them. Your sanity and your mental health is very important. Sometimes toxicity is people don't realize that they are toxic. So maybe if they're really close to you and if you think that talking to them will help, you can. I have one colleague who only focuses on everything that is negative. So she comes to the college in the morning and says, oh my God, Bangalore traffic is horrible. The next sentence is, oh, I don't believe I have a class right now. Why should I have to go to the class? The students are bad. After a week of this, I got exhausted. She used to sit right next to me. So one day I told her, ma'am, this is not helping us. So she said, what? I said, you keep complaining from like 9 o'clock in the morning to 4:30 in the evening, and it just makes me sad. So can you like not complain maybe? She didn't realize that she was complaining so much. So she said, okay, so does it bother you? I was like, yeah, because you always keep talking about what is not good. Let's try and focus on what is good. Yes, your class is bad, but there might be one incident that you might have liked in an entire day. Or just having lunch together with the person that you like. Or the fact that, you know, you can just get them in the morning and come to college. So probably that's just going to help. Sometimes you need to deal with toxic people. Sometimes it becomes very difficult because people are inherently toxic and their toxicity spreads into you. In such cases, personally, what I have done, I can talk from only my experience. I have removed myself from such situations and such people because I realize that there is enough sadness in life anyway. I don't think I need toxic people around me. So if it's not helping you, it is not a person that you should be with in any case. I have some of the questions are actually jumping up and down. What do you do if you deliberately tries to single you out and pressurize you? So again, something that happened to me when I was, so I'll just very quickly share, I think I have 2 more minutes in this session. When I went for my Fulbright session, my mentor was an Indian who had lived in the US for a very long time. And I realized that she didn't like me much because her sentences would begin with, you got a Fulbright because I accepted it. Your research is crappy. You don't work really hard. You know, you people in India don't have good research. And every day she used to take me to the, I stayed in her house for 1 week because I did not get college housing. And every day she used to drive me to the university, which was an hour's drive and an hour's drive back. And she always used to tell me how horrible I was, how bad I was at my subject, and that I didn't know anything. And I remember that I was already into 1.5 years of my PhD, so my data was already done. And at one point, I sat in the car and I said, Dr. So-and-so, I need to look for a place to stay. And she said, why? What do you have a problem in my house? I'm not even charging you rent. If you want to pay rent, you can pay a minimal rent. I said, no, I just can't deal with you. I don't think that a personal relationship is going to work with us. I think let's keep it professional. She said, oh, what do you mean? I said, no, you're too negative. I can't deal with it. You can tell me I'm wrong, but you're not telling me what to do with it. You're just telling me my work is bad. You're not telling me how do I go about making my work good. And I'm tired of listening to the fact that my work is bad. I don't know, honestly, till date where I had that courage from, but I did tell it to her. She could have thrown me out of that car at that point and I didn't know anybody there. But to be very honest, my supervisor back in FLU, the previous night I had spoken to her and I cried on the phone and I said, ma'am, I can't live here. I'm going to come back. I'm going to leave this scholarship. And she said just one thing. She said, don't focus on what she is doing to you. Focus on how you will not become like her if you become an educator ever. And I think that was a lesson that I took. I did move away from the house at all costs. And honestly speaking, moving away did give us a lot of space. We did work professionally. Throughout my working time, in the 1 year that I was there, we didn't have a very good relationship. But when I got back to India, after my PhD, actually, my PhD changed a lot of shape. She wrote a letter to me once I finished. And I actually told her that, you know, a lot of the sessions with her were harrowing personally. They were killing me. I lost my confidence as a researcher. But what is important is this one thing I learned from another teacher of mine who said, Don't focus on the criticism, focus on what she's criticizing you about and work on the content of the work. So my work did change a lot. And later she said, maybe I was wrong in the way I was putting it through. I said, yeah, because it was too harsh for me. You were not giving me solutions. You were asking me the questions. Those were the right questions, but they were asked very rudely. But now we share a very good relationship because I think I have also matured. I was around 25 at that point of time. Also, the fact that I chose took the situation to learn how A, not to be a teacher who gives feedback in a certain manner, and B, how do I work upon feedback even if it's given in the most harshest manner. I think those were the questions that I had here. I'm not sure if I have any more. How to handle emotional. Sir, I think you're on mute, sir.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Ma'am, shall we call it a day? Because no, thank you so much. Because no, we have lot many questions coming up. I know that you are so optimist. At the same time, your optimism is high, and you are resiliently to be optimist or optimist to be resilient, whatever. Okay, but that's
Thank
so
you.
good of you. But I'm sorry because I'm running out of time, and my madam is there. Dr. Parvati has already joined. Okay, so thank you so much,
Thank
Sweta,
you.
for coming,
Pleasure.
and hopefully you will be joining us for a lengthier session. Okay, but
Thank you.
I called for 2 sessions, but I could make it 1 because of your tough time. But I know that I know what is happening in Christ, by the way, and you are engaged. You are engaged, fully engaged. You were full bright and fully engaged also. Thank you so very much for coming, and hopefully you will be joining us again sometimes when we start for the next program. Okay, thank you so much, and love to have you, because almost all people that they point with double quote is that no, it's insightful, informative, and a wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank you.
And please do share your PPT to us.
I will share it right away.
And
I'll share it.
the questions that we discussed about.
Sure, sir. Sure, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Thank you.
Madam, Dr. Parvati ma'am, madam, you please switch it on, ma'am. Hello.
Hello. Yeah, may
Madam,
I
namaste. Namaste, ma'am.
Namaste, namaste.
How are you, ma'am?
Oh, fine, fine. Thank you.
You are ahead of time, as promised.
So shall we take like 5 minutes of break because they completed the
Madam,
session?
shall we take 10 minutes of break? That's what I'm requesting you, because we
Right.
have just come. Is that okay,
Okay.
madam? Or shall we start by 12 o'clock otherwise, if you permit me?
Shall we start it at 12 o'clock?
12 o'clock to 1 o'clock, that would do.
That is up to you. I don't mind.
No, not up to you. No, you are my resource person, madam. You have to speak me.
Let us start.
I will do what you said me to do. By the way,
Dr. Panda, now the time is 11:35. We can straight away start at 11:50.
ma'am, please. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Giving 15 minutes of break to all participants.
Okay, ma'am. Okay,
Right.
ma'am.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be joining at 11:50. I
Thank
request all the participants to join at 11:50, as advised by my resource person. Thank you.